Imagine this. The year is 1625. You wake to the hollow tolling of church bells. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times through the day. These are not bells of joy, not bells of weddings, nor celebration. They are the death knell, a reminder that yet another neighbor, another child, another friend has been taken. The smell in the air is not the freshness of morning bread, but a bitter mix of tar, smoke, and the unmistakable stench of decay. Through the cobbled streets rolls a heavy wooden cart, the driver's voice carrying like an omen, "Bring out your dead." And here's the truth. You might think you could handle this, that with modern resilience, with your determination, with your willpower, you could survive. But I promise you this. If you were dropped into the plagues of the 1600s, you would not last a week. Because this was not merely sickness. It was an entire unraveling of society, an age where fear, superstition, desperation, and cruelty thrived just as much as the disease itself. Tonight, let's walk into those darkened alleys together. Through the houses marked with plague crosses, past the looming figures of plague doctors, and into the suffocating dread of daily survival, the world before the plague hits. To understand why the plague was so devastating, you must first understand what normal life was like before it arrived. And for most people in the early 1600s, normal already meant hardship. You lived in a one-room cottage, walls of timber and daub, a thatched roof that leaked in the rain, a dirt floor that turned to mud in winter, straw stuffed into a sack served as your bed, crawling with fleas that bit in the night. Often the family pig or chickens slept inside with you, not out of affection, but because there was simply no separation between human and animal life. Bathing, rare soap, a luxury clothes were worn until they rotted, patched and repatched, caked with dirt. Waste disposal was crew chamber, pots dumped into the street, where open ditches carried human filth through the town. Diseases already haunted daily life. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery. Infant mortality was shockingly high. If you reached adulthood, it was already something of a victory. Now imagine this fragile life when the plague appeared. One day you're working the fields or selling goods in the market, and the next, your neighbor is feverish and coughing blood. His children, pale and swollen with dark lumps under their arms, are dying before your eyes. The whispers begin. The pestilence has come. Suddenly your fragile little world collapses. For in a society without clean water, without sanitation, without modern medicine, there was no barrier. Once the plague entered your town, it spread like fire through dry straw, unstoppable and merciless. And with it came not only sickness, but fear that corroded every bond of trust you had with your fellow man. Quarantine, a prison in your own home. When plague struck, officials turned to quarantine as their main weapon. In theory it was simple: contain the sick, and the disease cannot spread. In reality, it was a sentence of slow, terrifying death for entire households. The moment someone in your family showed symptoms, perhaps a high fever, a blackened bubo swelling in the groin or armpit, your house would be marked. A thick red or black cross painted across your door, with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," scrawled beside it. Guards were stationed outside, not to help you but to keep you in. Food, if you were lucky, might be delivered, though in small portions. Often the deliveries stopped altogether, and so your family would sit inside, waiting. Imagine the suffocating silence of quarantine. You hear your neighbor's cries through the thin wall, wailing, coughing, then silence. You see children staring out from shuttered windows, pale faces pressed to the glass. Inside your own home, you begin to wonder, will it be me next, or my child, or all of us together? The cruelest part was that even the healthy were locked in with the dying. If your brother fell ill, you had no choice. You could not leave. You would share the air, the bedding, the food, the fleece until it reached you as well. And if you dared to escape, the punishment was brutal. In many cities, breaking quarantine meant whipping, imprisonment, even execution. To flee was not just selfish, it was seen as treasonous against the community. So you stayed. You sat in the dark with your family, listening to the church bells toll, praying that somehow you would be the exception. But deep down, you knew. Quarantine was not protection. It was a waiting room for death. Plague doctors, the haunting figures of death. When you picture the plague, the most iconic image is that of the plague doctor. The black-robed figure with the long, bird-like beak mask. In the 1600s, their arrival in your street was both a strange comfort and a chilling omen. The plague doctor's outfit was designed for protection, though not in the way we'd think today. Their leather cloak was coated in wax, their gloves sealed tight, their masks stuffed with herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth. Why? Because of the belief in miasma theory. the idea that plague spread through bad air. The long beak acted as a crude filter. But here's the grim truth. Plague doctors were not healers in the modern sense. They were record keepers, witnesses, and often undertakers. Their cane, which they carried in hand, was not to aid their walking, it was to prod the sick and the dead without touching them directly. Imagine the scene. You're feverish, barely conscious, and you awaken to see a bird-headed figure looming over you, breathing heavily through a mask. To your delirious eyes, it is not a doctor, it is death itself, come to claim you. And if he decided to treat you, his methods were brutal. You might be bled with leeches until you fainted. Your swollen buboes might be lanced with a knife, the pus drained into bowls. You might be covered in strange ointments of dried toads or ashes. None of it worked. In fact, it often hastened death. The presence of a plague doctor was not a blessing. It was a grim reminder that you were already beyond saving. And worse, they charged for their services, often taking advantage of the desperate. The poor could not afford their help, while the wealthy often paid for false hope. So when you saw the tall, black figure turning the corner of your street, cane tapping against the stones, you knew your street, your neighbors, your home, had been marked by death. The horror of the buboes. The most terrifying mark of the plague were the buboes' grotesque swellings that appeared in the armpits, neck, or groin. Imagine waking to find your skin hot and tender, a strange lump forming beneath it. Within hours it swells to the size of an egg, then an apple, darkening from red to purple to black. The pain is indescribable. It burns, it throbs, it feels as though your flesh is being ripped apart from within. You try to touch it, to relieve the pressure, but it is agony. And you know this is the sign. Once the buboes come, death is near. Families watched helplessly as loved ones writhed in bed, their bodies covered in these dark, swollen tumors. Some split open, oozing pus and blood, filling the air with a putrid stench. Others remained sealed, the poison festering inside until the victim's body could no longer endure it. Desperate cures were tried. Some physicians lanced the buboes with knives, draining the foul liquid into bowls. Others applied poultices of herbs, dried toads, or even mixtures of human excrement, believing that like draws out like. None of it worked. And the worst part, even if you avoided contact, the plague spread by unseen carriers. The fleas on rats, the filth in the streets, the very air you breathed. Once the buboes appeared, it was already too late. You would not survive the pain, the fever, or the despair. Few ever did. The sounds of a dying city. One of the most haunting aspects of living through the plague was not just what you saw but what you heard. Imagine walking through a city under siege from disease. The first sound is silence. Streets once filled with chatter, markets, merchants calling out their wares now eerily quiet. Shops shuttered, taverns closed, schools abandoned. Silence broken only by the occasional clatter of a cartwheel. Then, the bells. Church bells tolling endlessly, each ring marking another soul lost sometime. Mothers weeping, calling for children who no longer answered. The hacking coughs of the dying echoing from open windows. The wails of the quarantined, begging to be released, knowing they would never see daylight again. At night, the silence returned, but darker, heavier. Dogs barked at the carts carrying corpses. Rats scuttled through the alleys, and always, somewhere in the distance, the hollow voice of the death cart driver. Bring out your dead. The sounds of the plague were the soundtrack of despair. And if you were there, you would never again know peace and silence. Superstition and scapegoats. In the 1600s, medicine was primitive, and science was only beginning to challenge old beliefs. When plague struck, people sought explanations not in germs, but in sin, witchcraft, and divine punishment. You might hear whispers that the plague was God's wrath for immoral living. Preachers thundered that it was punishment for dancing, drinking, or failing to attend church. And people believed them, turning on neighbors who lived differently or who were already despised. Others blamed outsiders, traveling merchants, beggars, or tragically entire communities of Jews, accused of poisoning wells or spreading the disease through sorcery. Pogroms erupted, innocent families slaughtered in the name of purging the court. Women, too, were often accused. A midwife whose patient died, an herbalist who brewed strange potions, even a widow who lived à la mort could be branded as witches. Torture and execution followed, the cries of the accused mingling with the cries of plague victims. Superstition was a second plague, spreading faster than the first. And even if you somehow survived the sickness, you might not survive the mob's suspicion. The black cross on the door, nothing struck fear into the heart like the appearance of the plague mark. When sickness entered a household, officials painted a large cross on the front door, usually in red or black, along with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." To the outside world, it was a warning. Keep away, death lives here. To those inside, it was a sentence. Neighbors avoided you. Friends crossed the street to avoid your gaze. Children who once played in your yard now shrank away in terror. The mark meant you were abandoned. It meant the watchman would soon seal your door, trapping you inside. It meant the food deliveries, if they came at all, would be thrown at your threshold as if feeding animals. And perhaps worst of all, the mark lingered long after death. Even when a house was emptied, the cross remained as a ghostly reminder. Streets filled with marked houses became silent graveyards. Entire neighborhoods turned into painted rows of doom. If your door bore the cross, you were already considered among the dead. Daily survival in a plague house. What did it mean to actually live inside a plague-stricken house? It was more than sickness, it was slow, creeping madness. At first, you might try to keep routine, cooking simple meals, praying together, whispering reassurances. But soon, the fever took someone. They burned hot, shivering, their body twisting with pain. You tried to soothe them with damp cloths, but nothing helped. Their cries filled the small room until finally, they fell silent. But there was no escape. The body lay in your home for days, sometimes weeks, until the death cart came. The stench of decay filled your nostrils as you tried to eat, to sleep, to live. Children cried at the sight, clutching your skirts or hands, too young to understand why their sibling would not wake. The days dragged into nights, sleepless, broken by coughing fits and whispered prayers. Rats gnawed at scraps. Fleas bit constantly. Fear gnawed at your soul. In the end, survival in a plague house wasn't about health. It was about enduring the unbearable, the sight of loved ones dying beside you, the certainty that you would be next, and the utter hopelessness of knowing there was no way out. Quarantine, the living tomb. One of the harshest realities of plague life was the quarantine system. The very word comes from the Italian quaranta giorni 40 days because that was how long ships suspected of carrying disease were held offshore before unloading. But on land, quarantine took on a crueler meaning. If your household was marked, the city watchman would nail the door shut from the outside. Windows were barred. Guards patrolled the street to make sure no one slipped out. You were now a prisoner in your own home. Imagine the terror of hearing the hammering of nails as officials sealed you inside. Your children screamed, your spouse begged, neighbors wept, but nothing could be done. You were locked away, cut off from the world. Food and water might be delivered, but often too little, too late. Days turned to weeks. The sick groaned, the healthy wasted away from hunger and fear. Bodies piled up inside, and you had no way of removing them. The air turned foul. The walls seemed to close in. You counted the days not in meals or prayers, but in corpses. And here lies the cruel truth. Even if you were healthy when the quarantine began, by the time the door was finally opened, you would almost certainly be dead either from starvation, infection, or despair. The plague doctors. Few images of the plague are more famous or more haunting than the plague doctor. Dressed head to toe in heavy robes, gloves, and a strange beaked mask, these figures stalked the streets like otherworldly birds of death. The mask itself was designed with a long curved beak, stuffed with herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth, believed to filter the poisonous air. The eyes were covered with glass lenses. The doctor carried a staff to prod the sick, examine buboes, or ward off desperate crowds without touching them. But here's the truth. Plague doctors were not miracle workers. Many had little to no medical training. Some were failed physicians. Others were simply hired because no one else dared. Their main role was to record deaths, supervise quarantines, and occasionally attempt crude treatments like bloodletting or lancing buboes. People feared them. Children cried at their approach. Some thought they were angels of death, others demons in disguise. And often, the sight of the doctor meant your family's fate was already sealed. The beaked mask may look theatrical to us now, but to the people of the 1600s it was the last face many ever saw. The death carts. One of the grimmest sights of the plague years were the death carts, trundling through the streets day and night. Wooden wagons, creaking under the weight of corpses, dragged by weary horses, or pushed by men half-mad with grief. The cart driver would ring a bell, crying out the dreaded words, "Bring out your dead." Families rushed to the door, dragging out bodies wrapped in sheets, sometimes still warm, sometimes days old. The stench was overpowering. Flies swarmed in clouds. There was no time for prayers, no dignity. Bodies were piled together, stripped of individuality, tossed in heaps like refuse. If you were lucky, Your loved one was given space to lie without being crushed beneath another. If not, they were lost in the tangle of limbs and faces. The carts rolled to the mass graves outside the city walls. Here huge pits were dug, trenches as wide as houses, as deep as wells. The dead were tumbled in, layer upon layer, covered with quicklime to slow the stench. No markers, no names, no remembrance. If you lived in a plague-stricken city, you could not escape the sight or smell of the carts. And you knew one day soon, it would come for you. Famine and starvation. The plague was not only a disease of the body, but also of society. As death spread, so too did hunger. Farmers sickened and fields went untended. Grain rotted in barns. Cattle wandered unattended until they too fell to neglect. Markets emptied. Merchants closed their stalls. Ships stopped bringing food for fear of contagion. Soon bread became scarce, then meat, then even the simplest vegetables. Families who once lived comfortably now starved in their homes. Imagine being a child in a plague year, crying for food as your parents had nothing to give. Some families boiled leather, chewed on bark, even ate rats to survive. In desperation, some stole from the dead, raiding plague houses not for wealth but for scraps of moldy bread. The wealthy fared only slightly better. They retreated to country estates, but even there, supplies dwindled, servants died, deliveries stopped, and the isolation became its own prison. The plague consumed not just life, but the means to sustain it, and for many, death came not by sickness but by hunger's cruel hand. The flight of the rich. In every age of plague, one rule was clear: the rich fled, the poor stayed behind. As soon as the first rumors of infection spread, noble families packed their belongings and left for country estates, hoping the clean air and isolation would protect them. Kings, queens, and ministers fled as well, abandoning their subjects to fate. Courts and councils dissolved. Cities were left leaderless, but flight was no guarantee. Servants carried infection with them, or travelers brought plague to rural villages. Sometimes whole estates sickened, their owners trapped far from help, and even in safety, the fear lingered. Every cough, every fever sparked panic. For the poor, escape was impossible. They lacked horses, carriages, or money to bribe guards at city gates. They were trapped among the rats and corpses, left to endure what the rich had fled. This divide deepened the bitterness of the time. The plague was not only a destroyer of life, it was a cruel mirror, showing who had privilege to run and who did not. The abandonment of the sick. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the plague was how it broke apart families. Love was tested by fear, and often, fear won. It was not uncommon for husbands to abandon wives, for parents to leave children, for siblings to desert one another at the first sign of illness. The fear of contagion was stronger than bonds of blood. You might wake in fever to find yourself alone, your family gone, your house silent. Or worse, you might be carried into the streets and left for the death cart, still breathing, still pleading for mercy. Neighbors closed their doors, friends vanished, communities turned inward, charity dried up, not because people did not care, but because terror hollowed them out. The plague turned men and women into shadows of themselves, their humanity stripped away by survival instinct, and even if you vowed to stay with your loved one, the odds were grim. You would likely share their fate, coughing, sweating, and dying beside them in a house filled with silence. The plague was not just a disease of the body, it was a destroyer of trust, love, and human bonds. The child victims. Few sights were more tragic than that of children suffering from the plague. Unlike adults, who often knew what was happening, children could not understand the horror overtaking their bodies. A child might begin with a fever, their cheeks flushed, their small body trembling. Soon the buboes appeared, grotesque lumps disfiguring their frame. They cried out for their mothers, clutching them in terror. Some slipped into delirium, speaking nonsense, reaching for toys that were no longer there. Mothers tried to comfort them, but their own hands shook with fear. Fathers wept openly, powerless to help. Some parents prayed desperately, offering to take the sickness upon themselves, but the plague was deaf to bargains. Children were often the first to be abandoned, left in plague hospitals where attendants barely touched them. Their tiny bodies were carried away on death carts, indistinguishable in the heaps of the dead. If you lived in the 1600s, you would have seen the grief of entire neighborhoods stripped of their young, playgrounds silenced, cradles empty. The plague stole the future along with the present. The plague hospitals. If you were unlucky enough to fall sick in a city that had a plague hospital, you might think you'd found hope. But entering one of these places was almost the same as entering your grave. The hospitals were not clean wards of healing. They were chaotic halls of suffering, often hastily built on the edge of towns or inside old monasteries. Patients lay in rows, moaning and writhing, their bodies covered in sores. The stench of sweat, blood, and decay filled every corner. Attendants were few and far between. Many were criminals or desperate poor, hired because no one else would risk the work. They wore makeshift coverings, splashed vinegar on their hands, and moved quickly between the dying. Care was minimal. A spoonful of broth, a crust of bread, sometimes a bleeding or poultice if a doctor was available, but mostly, patients were left to endure. Rats ran across the floors, fleas feasted on the weak, and the cries of the dying echoed through the night. And when a patient finally slipped into silence, their body was dragged away without ceremony, replaced by another. To be sent to a plague hospital was not a chance at life. It was an acknowledgement that your community had given up on you. Religion in the shadow of death. In the 1600s, faith was the bedrock of life, and when plague struck, people turned desperately to religion. But instead of comfort, it often brought new layers of fear. Church bells tolled constantly, announcing the dead. Priests walked the streets, offering last rites through closed doors, shouting Latin blessings into windows where families huddled inside. Processions wound through towns, men and women whipping themselves bloody in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for sin. Sermons thundered about wickedness, gambling, lust, pride, and urged repentance. Some communities banned dancing, singing, even laughter, as though joy itself invited God's anger. But religion also fractured under the strain. Some saw priests abandoning their flocks, fleeing with the rich. Others accused Jews, foreigners, or heretics of bringing the disease, sparking waves of persecution. Whole groups were tortured or killed, their deaths adding cruelty to an already brutal time. Faith was both bomb and weapon. It gave hope to some, but crushed others under guilt and suspicion. And no matter how many prayers rose to heaven, the plague continued its relentless march. Superstition and strange cures. Without real medicine, people clung to superstition, and in the 1600s, that meant some of the most bizarre and desperate cures imaginable. Some carried dried toads in their pockets, believing the animal's magic would draw out the sickness. Others wore charms made of gems, bones, or written prayers sealed in lockets. Mothers tied red ribbons around their children's necks, convinced it warded off infection. Apothecaries sold concoctions of mercury, arsenic, and crushed emeralds, poisons that only worsened suffering. Others brewed potions from human remains, powdered mummy, dried blood, or the fat of the dead. One remedy involved cutting open a live chicken and strapping it to the buboes, the belief being that the bird would absorb the disease. When the chicken died, another was applied. Some thought smoke would purify the air, so they burned herbs, incense, or piles of dung, choking the streets in acrid fumes. Wealthy families hired fumigators to wave censers of burning pitch through their homes. To the sick, none of it helped. But in an age of terror, people clung to anything that offered the illusion of control, no matter how strange or cruel. The scapegoats. When death has no reason, people invent one, and during the plagues of the 1600s, countless innocents suffered as scapegoats. Foreigners were accused of poisoning wells, beggars were beaten in the streets, blamed for spreading contagion. In some places, entire Jewish communities were slaughtered, accused of witchcraft or dark pacts with the devil. Witch hunts surged. Women who lived alone, healers with strange herbs, or simply those who drew suspicion were dragged to trial. Tortured until they confessed, they were burned or drowned, their deaths bringing false comfort to the terrified masses. Even doctors became targets. If too many patients died, people claimed the physicians were spreading the plague on purpose. Some were attacked, their homes burned. In villages, outsiders were turned away at sword point, even if they were starving or sick. Hospitality vanished, replaced by violence. The plague was not just a disease, it was a spark that lit fires of hatred, consuming the vulnerable while the true enemy, the bacteria itself, remained unseen. The mass graves. For centuries, death had rituals, funerals, prayers, burials marked with crosses or stones. But the plague erased all of that. When death carts arrived at the burial grounds, they tipped their cargo into massive trenches. Bodies fell together in heaps, stripped of names, faces, and dignity. Quicklime was poured over the corpses, both to mask the stench and to speed decomposition. Gravediggers worked tirelessly, but even they could not keep up. Pits overflowed. Sometimes earth was barely scraped over the bodies before more arrived. In the summer heat, the smell spread for miles. If you were a mourner, There was no chance to weep by the grave of your loved one. Their final resting place was unknown, swallowed by the anonymous pit. And when new plagues came, old pits were dug open again, bones mingling with the freshly dead. Generations stacked upon generations, forgotten beneath the soil. It was as if the plague wanted to erase not only lives, but memory itself. The silent cities. One of the strangest and most unsettling effects of the plague was the silence. Cities that once bustled with life, markets buzzing, taverns roaring, churches ringing, fell into eerie stillness. Streets were empty but for death carts. Shops stood closed, their shutters nailed tight. Dogs howled in the distance, abandoned when their masters died. Cats prowled, feeding on rats. Bells tolled endlessly, but otherwise quiet blanketed the towns like a shroud. Travelers wrote of walking through entire neighborhoods without seeing a soul. Doors stood open to houses where everyone inside was dead. Gardens overgrew, weeds cracked through cobblestones, and the smell of rot clung to every breeze. Silence was its own kind of terror. You heard only your heartbeat, the creak of wood, the flutter of birds. Every sound felt amplified, unnatural, and you knew this was not peace, but death's shadow. The silence of the plague-stricken cities was a silence no one ever forgot. The collapse of order. Society depends on order, laws, trade, authority. But the plague unraveled it all. Courts stopped holding trials, armies disbanded, soldiers fleeing rather than risk infection. Trade routes closed, and with them, the lifeblood of towns. Coins lost value when there was no bread to buy, no market to spend in. Thieves prowled empty streets, looting abandoned homes. Bandits set up on roads, preying on fleeing families. Sometimes even officials turned to crime, stealing food or demanding bribes from the desperate. Law itself faltered, judges died, constables disappeared, and with them, justice vanished. In some towns, militiamen patrolled, enforcing harsh curfews with sword and whip. In others, there was no law at all, only survival. The plague didn't just kill it unstitched, the very fabric of society, leaving chaos in its wake. The fire that followed. In some plague-stricken cities, fire was seen as both a cleanser and a destroyer. Officials ordered entire houses burned when they were suspected of being contaminated. Furniture, bedding, even clothes were set aflame in the streets, smoke rising like offerings to some angry god. Families watched helpless as all they owned was reduced to ash. But uncontrolled fires also broke out, spreading through weakened towns where no one remained to fight them. Flames devoured wooden houses, leaping from rooftop to rooftop while survivors fled in panic. For some, fire was mercy. It consumed the stench, the filth, the rats. For others, it was just another form of death. To survive the plague, you also had to survive the fire, and many did not. The plague doctor's dreadful duty. We imagine plague doctors as shadowy figures in beaked masks, but in truth their work was far darker than any costume. These men, often young or desperate physicians, were hired by towns to treat plague victims, but treat is generous. Their duty was as much about record-keeping and corpse inspection as about healing. Plague doctors were bound by grim contracts. They were forbidden to refuse patients, forbidden to leave town, and often forbidden to charge individuals, since they were paid a salary by the city. This meant they had to walk into houses no one else dared enter, rooms filled with corpses, patients coughing black blood, fleas swarming on every surface. The famous beak mask, stuffed with herbs like rosemary, camphor, or cloves, was their only defense against the miasma, the foul air thought to carry disease. They carried a wooden cane to prod and examine patients without touching them, and sometimes to ward off the desperate, who tried to cling to them for help. Many plague doctors died within weeks of beginning their work. They were hated as much as feared, believed by some to spread the disease, cursed by others when their cures failed. To be a plague doctor in the 1600s was not an honor. It was a slow march toward your own grave. Quarantine and the locked gates. One of the harshest realities of the plague was quarantine. To stop the spread, entire towns sealed themselves off, locking gates and posting guards who would kill anyone trying to enter or leave. Travelers approaching a city might find themselves turned back at sword point. Merchant wagons were stopped and searched, their goods fumigated with smoke before being allowed through. Ships arriving in ports were forced to anchor offshore for 40 days. The origin of the word quarantine. For those already inside, quarantine was worse. If your house showed signs of plague, officials nailed your door shut, trapping you inside. Families begged from windows as soldiers patrolled outside, ensuring no one escaped. Sometimes healthy members died alongside the sick, never given the chance to flee. Villagers cut off trade, meaning food supplies dwindled. Hunger became as deadly as infection. The countryside grew hostile, with farmers refusing to sell grain to outsiders, fearing contamination. Quarantine may have slowed the plague, but it turned towns into prisons and homes into tombs. The children of the plague, perhaps the most haunting victims of the 1600s plague, were the children. They suffered not only from the disease itself, but from abandonment, neglect, and exploitation. When parents died, children were left alone in houses with corpses, wandering the streets in shock. Some starved before anyone noticed. Others were rounded up and thrown into orphanages that overflowed with sickness and hunger. Infants were particularly vulnerable. Wet nurses, if still alive, often refused to feed plague children, fearing infection. Babies were abandoned at church steps or convent doors, where nuns struggled to care for them amidst waves of the dying. Older children faced another fate, labor. Desperate authorities put them to work as helpers for plague doctors, gravediggers, or attendants in plague houses. Many were forced to handle corpses or care for the sick, effectively condemning them to infection. The nursery rhymes we still sing, like "Ring Around the Rosie," are believed by some to echo these children's experiences of plague. Whether or not that's true, the fact remains. Childhood in the time of plague was short, harsh, and often ended in tragedy. The vanishing aristocracy. At first, the rich thought they were safe. They fled to country estates, locked themselves in castles, and surrounded their manors with guards. But wealth was no shield against fleas. Servants who brought food, laundresses who cleaned clothes, even pets carried infection into the halls of the elite. Rumors spread of noble families wasting away in gilded chambers, their silk sheets soaked with sweat, their gold goblets left untouched as they died, just like the poor. Entire dynasties collapsed, their titles vanishing in a generation. Some aristocrats did survive, but at a cost. They abandoned entire towns, refusing to aid their tenants, fleeing with their wealth while leaving thousands to die. Their selfishness fueled riots, as peasants looted manors and burned estates. For the lower classes, watching the aristocracy fall was shocking. It was proof that money and power could not bribe death. The plague was the great equalizer, and in the 1600s it dragged kings and beggars alike into the same shallow graves. The rats and their empire. Behind every plague was a silent empire. The rats. These creatures thrived in the dirty streets, feasting on garbage and multiplying in swarms. In the 1600s, cities were ideal for them: wooden houses, piles of waste, no sewage systems, and plenty of food. Fleas that carried the deadly bacteria hopped from rat to rat, and when the rats died, they leaped to humans. This invisible bridge of disease spread faster than any army could march. Witnesses described rats overrunning markets, scurrying through homes, even falling from ceilings. Their corpses littered the streets, bloated and twitching with fleas. Children sometimes played with them, unaware they were touching death itself. Yet, strangely, many people didn't blame rats at all. They thought cats and dogs spread the plague instead. In some places, officials ordered mass killings of cats, ironically making the rat problem worse. The plague was not only a human story. It was the victory of vermin over civilization, rats thriving while empires collapsed around them. The empty harvest. The plague didn't just kill people, destroyed the land itself. With so many dead or sick, fields went untended, crops withered, and livestock wandered free. Harvests rotted in the fields as there were too few hands to gather them. Cows went unmilked, chickens starved in their coops, and horses became feral. In some regions, wolves grew bold, prowling near villages abandoned by humans. Food prices skyrocketed. Bread became a luxury, meat a rarity. The poor turned to eating grass, bark, or boiled leather to survive. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making survivors even more vulnerable to infection. Winter was especially cruel. Families huddled together in freezing cottages, with little firewood and less food, listening to the coughs that signaled the plague had arrived in their home. In the 1600s, the plague was not just a disease, it was a famine maker, stripping away both lives and livelihoods in a single blow. The madness of the survivors. For those who lived through the plague, survival did not mean peace. Many were left haunted, broken by the horrors they had seen. People described strange behaviors, survivors wandering the streets, speaking to ghosts of the dead, mothers clutching empty blankets where their babies had been, men refusing to wash or eat, convinced they too were already doomed. Some fell into wild ecstatic religions, believing they had been spared for divine purpose. Others turned to excess drinking, gambling, visiting brothels, grabbing at every pleasure, knowing death could come again at any time. Communities were fractured. Neighbors no longer trusted each other. Friends avoided contact. families split apart. Survivors were bound less by joy than by trauma. Even years later, when the plague had passed, the fear lingered. Every cough, every fever sparked panic. Every rumor of sickness sent people fleeing. The plague left scars that lasted far longer than the disease itself. The burning of clothes and possessions. In plague-stricken towns, possessions were seen as poisoned. If someone died, their clothes, bedding, and furniture weren't passed down to relatives. They were burned in massive bonfires. Imagine the heartbreak. A widow watching her husband's best coat, his boots, his treasured letters all go up in flames, while neighbors shouted at her to keep her distance. Beloved wedding dresses, cribs, family portraits, everything was treated as contaminated. Merchants who sold second-hand clothing were particularly hated. People whispered that used garments carried fleas, spreading the plague from one body to another. In some towns, second-hand markets were banned entirely. This destruction was a desperate attempt to stop the invisible enemy. The air reeked of smoke, not only from funeral pyres, but from the constant burning of the very fabric of daily life. The plague robbed people not just of family but of memory. Even the objects that told their stories were reduced to ash. The watchmen and their cruel task. To enforce plague measures, cities hired watchmen. Their job was brutal, guarding the doors of infected houses, making sure no one escaped. Armed with halberds or pikes, these men stood outside day and night, listening to screams from within. Sometimes they were bribed to let someone out, but if caught, the punishment was death. Watchmen were hated. Families cursed them through barred windows, blaming them for their imprisonment. Children begged for bread, but the watchmen could only push food through cracks or leave it on doorsteps. Some watchmen grew cruel, mocking the dying or stealing from houses once everyone inside was gone. Others grew sick themselves, infected by the constant exposure. To live under the eye of a watchman was to live in a cage. To be a watchman was to be hated by all sides. A jailer in a city turned into one vast prison. The searchers of the dead. Perhaps no job was more feared than that of the searchers. These were usually older women, paid to inspect corpses and declare whether death had been caused by plague. Armed with nothing but a stick to lift clothing or roll bodies, they ventured into stinking rooms where no one else dared go. They carried with them a terrifying power, to mark a house as plague-ridden. Once they did, the household would be sealed, its inhabitants condemned. Because of this, searchers were often accused of corruption. Some were said to take bribes, declaring a death natural so the family could escape quarantine. Others were accused of cruelty, laughing as they nailed doors shut. Yet, many searchers were themselves victims, poor widows who needed the small pay to survive. They walked daily among corpses, touching death with their own hands, until at last they, too, succumbed. To be a searcher was to live one step away from the grave. The collapse of faith. Plague tested religion like nothing else. Churches overflowed with prayers. Processions of penitents marched through streets. Flagellants whipped themselves bloody in the hope of appeasing God. Yet, the deaths only grew. Priests, once seen as untouchable, fell ill and died. Some abandoned their parishes, fleeing to the countryside. Others locked church doors, refusing to give last rites to plague victims. This bred fury. People accused clergy of cowardice and corruption. Some even turned to witchcraft or pagan charms when the church offered no protection. But for others, plague deepened faith. They believed the suffering was a divine punishment for sin, a test of endurance. Entire towns took vows of fasting, prayer, and silence. The plague fractured belief. Some lost God entirely, while others clung to him more fiercely than ever. Either way, faith itself was forever scarred. The rise of quack cures, with medicine powerless. The 1600s became a carnival of quackery. Markets swarmed with men selling miracle potions, powders, and amulets. One cure promised safety by drinking crushed emeralds dissolved in wine. Another involved carrying dried toads in your pocket. Doctors recommended bleeding, vomiting, or swallowing mercurial deadly in their own right. Perfumed vinegar, stuffed oranges, and sachets of herbs were hawked as plague repellents. Some people wore talismans inscribed with mystical symbols, believing they could deflect illness like armor. The wealthy paid fortunes for exotic remedies, ground-up mummy from Egypt, unicorn horns, which were really narwhal tusks, or bezoar stones from goat stomachs. All useless, but hope was priceless. Charlatans grew rich, while the poor wasted their last coins on lies. In the end, none of these cures stopped the fleas, the rats, or the unseen bacteria. The plague was a reminder that in the 1600s, medicine was often indistinguishable from superstition. The silent villagers, Entire villages vanished in the plague years. A traveler might ride through the countryside and find fields empty, cottages overgrown with weeds, church bells silent. Some villages died so completely that they were never rebuilt. Their names linger only in old maps or half-buried gravestones. In other cases, a handful of survivors remained, but they lived in eerie silence. Houses stood empty, doors swinging in the wind, food rotting on tables where families had once sat. Wolves and foxes prowled the abandoned lanes. The silence of these villages was a warning to anyone passing through. Death had come, and no one had survived. The plague was not just about individual loss, it erased entire communities from history, wiping them away like words from a page. The bills of mortality. In London and other large cities, the weekly bills of mortality were dreaded documents, printed and sold cheaply. They listed the number of deaths and their causes, neighborhood by neighborhood. People bought them like newspapers, scanning the grim tallies. Plague, 1,200. Consumption, 400. Drowned, 7. Murdered. 2 families clutched the bills in terror, searching to see if their own parish had been struck hardest. The bills became a measure of fear. If deaths rose, people locked themselves inside. If numbers fell, hope flickered. But often the figures were understated. Officials concealed the true scale to prevent panic. Yet the bills also reveal something chilling: how normalized death had become. It was reduced to numbers on a page, sold for a penny, read over morning ale. Death became not a tragedy, but a statistic. The abandoned hospitals of the 1600s were nothing like today. They were overcrowded, filthy, and dangerous. When plague struck, many simply shut their doors. Doctors refused to enter, nurses fled, and patients were turned out into the streets. Some hospitals became plague houses themselves, filled with dying victims locked inside until they expired. Others stood eerily empty, their beds unoccupied, their halls echoing with silence. People avoided them, believing they were cursed. The sick had nowhere to go. Some collapsed on church steps, others begged for shelter at monasteries, but most were left to die at home. The plague revealed a terrible truth. Medicine could not save you, and institutions built to heal were powerless against the tide of death. The plague pits of London. Perhaps the most horrific image of the plague is the mass graves. In London, when churchyards overflowed, huge pits were dug. Corpses were brought by the cartload, dumped in, and covered with lime. Witnesses described the stench so strong that people fainted in the streets. Pits sometimes filled faster than they could be closed, and dogs and pigs were seen gnawing at uncovered bodies. At night, the dead wagons creaked through the streets, their drivers crying, "Bring out your dead." As families dragged corpses to the curb, the pits held thousands. They erased individuality. Rich and poor, old and young, all mingled together in a single foul heap. Today, some of these pits still lie under modern streets, silent reminders of the city's darkest days. The survivors' bargain. At last, when the plague began to wane, survivors emerged into a changed world. Towns were half empty, families torn apart, entire trades collapsed. Yet for some, opportunity had arisen. Servants inherited their master's wealth, laborers demanded higher wages, and widows suddenly controlled property. This was the cruel bargain of the plague. It destroyed millions, but for the few who lived, it reshaped society. Fear lingered, yes, but so did resilience. Survivors rebuilt, carried on, and prepared, always fearing the next outbreak, which history proved was never far away. To survive the plague was not simply to keep your life, it was to live in a world transformed by death. The empty markets. Imagine walking into a city marketplace in the middle of the plague years. Once, it had been a riot of colors and sounds. Fishmongers shouting their prices, butchers hacking at carcasses, women selling bread, children running between stalls. Now, silence. Half the stalls are abandoned, their owners dead or in hiding. The ones that remain are cautious and grim. Goods are fewer, more expensive. Fish lie rotting on tables because no one dares touch them, convinced that illness clings to flesh. Farmers are afraid to bring produce into town, fearing contagion. Money itself is treated like poison. Coins are dropped into bowls of vinegar before being exchanged. Shopkeepers take payment with long tongs, pushing goods across counters without touching hands. And yet, life still demands to go on. People risk the market because they must eat, but each trip is a gamble with death. To shop in these markets was to feel that death hovered between every loaf of bread and every coin that changed hands. The lonely children. Plague devoured parents faster than it did their children. This left behind countless orphans, wandering, starving, and unwanted. Some were too young to understand. They clutched at their dead mothers, trying to wake them. Others begged in the streets, filthy and hollow-eyed. Towns tried to herd them into almshouses, but there were too many. Some were left to fend for themselves, forming gangs of wild, desperate children. The youngest were sometimes taken in by surviving relatives, but superstition ran deep. Neighbors whispered, "What if the children carried the sickness?" Families often refused to adopt them, fearing death would follow. Worst of all, children who survived the plague often carried scars for life. Some were disfigured with boils, others stunted by malnutrition. Even in survival, they bore the marks of catastrophe. The plague was not only the end of families, it was the birth of a generation of lost, wandering souls, growing up in a world where childhood itself had been erased. The abandonment of the sick. In the darkest hours, fear overcame even love. Accounts from the 1600s tell of families who abandoned their sick in locked rooms, too terrified to stay. Husbands fled from wives, mothers from children, priests from parishioners. Some threw food through windows rather than entering homes, treating loved ones like dangerous animals. It wasn't always cruelty, it was terror. People convinced themselves that staying near the sick was certain death. Survival meant shutting the door, plugging your ears to the screams inside, and walking away. This betrayal haunted survivors. Those who lived long enough to see the plague subside remembered that in their hour of need, human compassion had failed. Neighbors became strangers, kin became enemies. The plague destroyed not only bodies but trust itself, the stench of death. To live in a plague city was to live in a world where the air itself seemed cursed. The stench was unbearable. Everywhere bodies rotted in homes, on carts, in pits, too shallow to contain them. The air was thick with smoke from burning clothes, herbs, and incense, all meant to mask the smell. But nothing could. Even the wealthiest houses stank, for no one could escape the winds that carried death. People believed the odor itself, the miasma, was the plague. They carried handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or stuffed their noses with spices. Wealthy men walked with oranges pierced with cloves, held constantly to their faces. Yet, no matter the perfumes, the reality remained. The streets reeked of rot, of fear, of an entire city suffocating under invisible corruption. The plague wasn't only seen and felt, it was smelled everywhere, a constant reminder that life and death were bound together in the air you breathed. The criminals of the plague. The plague didn't only bring out fear, it brought out crime. Thieves prowled the streets, looting abandoned houses and breaking into plague-stricken homes. Some dressed as searchers or watchmen to gain access, stealing valuables from the dead. Others turned to darker crimes. Rumors spread of body snatchers digging up plague pits to strip corpses of jewelry. There were even whispers of men who murdered the sick in order to rob them before officials arrived. The authorities tried to crack down. In some cities, plague thieves were hanged on the spot if caught. But with so many dead and so few guards, much went unnoticed. The plague was supposed to be a great equalizer, striking rich and poor alike. Yet it also revealed how greed and desperation thrived in the shadows of catastrophe. The last rites denied. In the Christian world of the 1600s, the last rites were everything. To die without them was to risk your soul's eternal fate. Yet during the plague, countless people died Priests refused to enter plague houses. Some gave blessings from a distance, shouting prayers from the street. Others fled altogether, leaving entire towns without spiritual care. This abandonment struck terror into the faithful. For many, the idea of dying without confession, without absolution, was worse than the plague itself. Families begged priests to come, but too often, the doors remained shut. Gravediggers, not clergy, became the last faces many saw. Instead of hymns, the dying heard only the creak of a cart, the thud of dirt on wood. To live through the plague was to face not only physical death, but the fear of spiritual damnation. The plague doctor's legend. The image of the plague doctor with his long, bird-like mask comes from these times. But in the 1600s, the figure was both real and mythical. The masks, stuffed with herbs, were meant to filter the air. Doctors wore waxed coats, gloves, and wide-brimmed hats, looking more like sinister specters than healers. To the poor, plague doctors seemed terrifying. They appeared at doors only when death was certain. Children screamed at the sight of them. Some even believed the doctors were angels of death, marking the doomed. Most plague doctors were not skilled physicians at all. Many were young apprentices, failed doctors, or men hired simply because no one else would take the job. Few saved lives. Most grew rich, collecting salaries, then fled when danger became too close. The plague doctor became a symbol of false hope, a figure who promised safety but usually brought only despair. The fires of purification. One common belief was that fire could purify the air. Cities burned huge bonfires in streets, filling the skies with smoke. Sometimes herbs like juniper or rosemary were tossed in to make the fumes cleansing. At night, entire neighborhoods glowed with the light of these fires. The air grew heavy with smoke, and people huddled indoors, hoping it would drive away the invisible plague. But there were darker uses of fire, too. In some towns, houses of the dead were set ablaze. Rather than risk reopening them, entire streets went up in flames, destroying not only infection but the lives of survivors who had nothing to do with the sick. Fire became both a weapon and a terror, desperate attempt to fight death, even as it consumed what little remained of normal life. The false prophets. When the plague raged, so too did prophecy. Street preachers declared that the end of the world was near. Some pointed to comets in the sky or strange weather as signs of God's wrath. Others preached that the plague was punishment for sins, gambling, drinking, prostitution, and called for mass repentance. But not all prophets were holy. Some were frauds, selling visions and claiming they could predict who would live or die. A few promised salvation for those who followed them, leading frightened groups into the countryside, away from towns. Many never returned. The plague tore away reason. People turned to anyone who offered certainty, even if it was madness. Prophecy was both a comfort and a curse, another mirror of desperation in a world drowning in death. The echo of silence. When the plague finally loosened its grip, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the screams that had come before. Church bells rang again, but not as often. Streets filled slowly, cautiously. Survivors walked like ghosts among ruins, unsure how to live in a world where so much had been lost. Fields went untilled. Trade routes lay broken. Friendships and families were gone forever. For decades afterward, towns remembered the plague years as a scar that never fully healed. The silence was not peace, was grief. And even as life returned, the memory of death lingered in every creak of a cart, every toll of a bell, every shadow that passed too closely. The plague had passed, but it had left behind a world forever changed. The desperation for quack cures. In a world where no one understood the plague, cures became a desperate market. Charlatans set up stalls offering potions, powders, and pills. Some sold plague water, a mix of alcohol, herbs, and crushed gems. Others hawked amulets, promising magical protection. Wealthy families bought bezoar stones, said to neutralize poisons, and wore them like treasures. One bizarre method involved swallowing live spiders rolled in butter, believed to trap the poison. Another cure instructed patients to press a dead toad against a plague sore, leaving it there until the toad swelled with the infection. None of it worked. People still died in droves. Yet hope is a powerful medicine. Families emptied their purses, chasing miracles in bottles, clinging to anything that offered the faintest chance of survival. For quacks and frauds, the plague was less a tragedy and more a booming business. The abandoned villages. Across the countryside, entire villages simply disappeared. If plague struck a small settlement, sometimes the survivors fled and never returned. Fields lay empty, houses crumbled, wells grew stagnant. A few villages were remembered only in records, plague villages marked as cursed, left to rot. Travelers sometimes stumbled upon these ghost towns, doors hanging open, half-eaten meals left on tables, toys scattered on floors. Silence swallowed everything, as though time itself had stopped. Some legends grew that these villages were haunted by the restless dead. Locals avoided them, whispering that anyone who entered would bring the plague back home. In some cases, they were right. Disease clung to clothing, blankets, even soil. The abandoned village became a grim monument to how quickly a community could be erased. The rise of pest houses in desperate attempts to control contagion. Cities created pest houses, buildings where the sick were sent to die. They were prisons more than hospitals. People were dragged there against their will, guarded by armed men, cut off from family. Inside, the conditions were horrific. Straw beds soaked with filth. The groans of the dying echoing through dark halls. Rats scurrying freely. Few who entered a pest house ever came out. For many, being sent there was worse than death itself. Families pleaded, bribed, even fought to keep their loved ones at home, fearing the pest house as a place without dignity or care. Yet to authorities, they were necessary. Better to sacrifice a few within walls than risk the plague spreading through the whole city. The pest house symbolized the cruel trade-off between survival and humanity. The plague's impact on the nobility. Even the wealthy could not escape, though they tried. Aristocrats fled to country estates, shutting themselves in with servants, hoping distance would save them. They held feasts with imported food, burned perfumes, and ordered servants to scrub floors daily. Some even walled themselves off completely, refusing to let anyone in or out. Yet the plague crept through cracks. Servants carried it unknowingly. Letters, laundry, even gifts from friends could bring infection. Accounts tell of noble families who died entirely, leaving grand estates silent and empty. Ironically, some nobles fared worse than peasants. The poor, already used to hardship and survival, sometimes recovered in greater numbers. The plague revealed that wealth could buy comfort, but not life. It humbled kings and paupers alike, though the poor bore the greater weight of suffering. The collapse of law and order. As the plague spread, laws unraveled, courts closed, jails overflowed, and sheriffs refused to arrest suspects for fear of infection. Criminals took advantage. Highwaymen robbed travelers on deserted roads. Smugglers thrived, sneaking goods past quarantined towns. Gangs looted homes under cover of chaos. Sometimes even the authorities turned corrupt. Watchmen hired to guard plague houses often abandoned their posts or worse, extorted families for bribes. Justice faltered because survival took priority. A thief stealing bread might be ignored, while a grieving mother breaking quarantine could face punishment. The balance of law shifted not on morality but on fear. For many survivors, the memory of plague years was less about the disease and more about how society itself fractured. When order dissolved, the sailor's curse. Ports were the lifeblood of 17th century Europe, and they were also gateways of death. Ships carried the plague as efficiently as they carried spices and silks. Rats swarmed the holds, fleas in their fur. Sailors, weakened by months at sea, often became infected first. By the time a ship docked, half the crew might be dead. Authorities tried quarantines, forcing ships to anchor offshore for 40 days quaranta, journey the root of the word quarantine. Flags marked plague ships, warning others away. But smugglers slipped through, and desperate sailors often lied about sickness on board. Ports became places of dread. Merchants saw fortunes vanish as goods rotted at sea. Cities feared every arriving mast on the horizon. For the plague was not only a killer of men, it was a strangler of trade and prosperity. The strain on faith. The plague tested religion like nothing else. Churches filled with prayers and weeping, but also anger. Why would God allow such suffering? Was he punishing the wicked or abandoning the faithful? Some clung tighter to faith. Flagellant groups marched through towns, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of atonement. Others built shrines or carried relics, pleading for miracles. But many began to doubt. Priests fled, prayers went unanswered, and the plague struck sinners and saints alike. The sight of children dying shattered belief for countless families. This crisis of faith would ripple into future generations, planting seeds of skepticism that eventually challenged church authority. The plague killed not only bodies but certainty itself, the healers of desperation. Not all healers were frauds. Some genuinely tried, even if their methods were misguided. Barber surgeons lanced buboes with knives, draining pus to release poison. Herbalists brewed teas of sage, wormwood, or root-wise. Women burned herbs, washed wounds with vinegar, or used charms passed down for centuries. A few remedies offered small relief: cleanliness, fresh air, limited contact, but most could not stop the disease. Still, people clung to these healers because they represented hope. For some, the memory of a gentle hand, a whispered prayer, or even the illusion of care mattered more than the cure. In a time when the world felt abandoned, a healer's presence was a flicker of humanity in the shadows. The broken generations, children who survived the plague, grew up in a different world. They had seen death more intimately than most adults today. Many lost parents, siblings, entire communities. They inherited farms with no workers, shops with no customers, and traditions with no elders to pass them on. This generation carried scars that shaped the century to come. They were hardened, practical, often mistrustful. They valued survival above sentiment, because sentiment had nearly killed their parents. Some historians believe this generational trauma influenced everything from harsher punishments in law to colder family structures. The plague didn't just kill individuals, it reshaped the psychology of entire nations. The return of life. And yet, after all the devastation, life always returned. Markets reopened, fields were plowed, bells rang for weddings instead of funerals. Survivors clung to joy more fiercely than before. Some even celebrated recklessly, drinking, dancing, spending fortunes because they had stared death in the face and survived. But life after the plague was never the same. Towns remembered the pits, the pest houses, the silence of streets. Survivors carried both grief and resilience. The plague was a storm that left scars on stone, bone, and soul. And for those who endured, it was proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, life would crawl back into the light. The plague doctor's secrets. The iconic image of the 1600s plague, the beaked doctor, is more than just a symbol. It was a survival suit, part science, part superstition. The leather coat was meant to repel miasma, or bad air. The beak was stuffed with lavender, cloves, or vinegar-soaked sponges. Doctors believed these herbs purified the air before it reached their lungs. But what they didn't advertise was the fear behind the mask. Many plague doctors were not skilled physicians at all, but desperate men, sometimes failed barbers or surgeons, hired because no one else would do it. They were often strangers to the town, disposable, because locals knew most would not survive. They kept journals, recording symptoms with grim detail: blackened buboes, choking coughs, delirium before death. Some even performed crude autopsies, searching in vain for the source of the disease. The beak mask became a symbol not of healing, but of hopelessness. When one appeared on your street, it meant death had arrived. Plague, superstitions, and dark beliefs. In the absence of science, fear bred bizarre superstitions. People carried charms of dried frogs or powdered emeralds. Mothers hung snakeskins over cradles to ward off evil spirits. Some burned sulfur inside homes until the smoke drove them choking into the streets, believing the stench would drive out plague vapors. More sinister were the scapegoats. Foreigners, beggars, and Jews were often blamed, accused of poisoning wells or summoning demons. This led to violent persecutions, pogroms, and executions. The plague did not only kill with fever, it tore communities apart with suspicion. One chilling belief was that plague could be called by saying its name aloud too often. Families whispered in hushed tones, fearing that words themselves carried contagion. Silence, then, became a kind of superstition. Entire towns grew eerily quiet, as though speaking too loudly might summon death. The economy of death. The plague transformed death into a grim economy. Gravediggers demanded triple pay, often drinking themselves into oblivion to numb the horror of their work. Coffin makers could barely keep up, hammering day and night. In cities like London, the demand for wood grew so high that whole forests were stripped bare to feed funeral pyres. Even thieves adapted. Some raided plague houses, knowing valuables were left unguarded. Others stripped the dead in the streets, selling clothes after a quick wash. These garments carried fleas and the cycle of infection spread again. A handful grew rich on the suffering. Apothecaries, coffin builders, and even musicians who played at plague burials found themselves in high demand. For the cruelest of opportunists, the plague was a business, the survivor's guilt. For those who lived, survival carried its own torment. Why had they lived when neighbors, friends, and family had all been taken? Survivors described years of guilt, haunted by dreams of those they could not save. Parents who buried children sometimes felt cursed. Children who buried parents carried loneliness like a permanent wound. Many survivors believed they owed their lives to God and lived with renewed piety. Others turned reckless, living as though tomorrow was already promised to death. Taverns filled, gambling houses thrived, marriages were rushed. Some even abandoned their faith, convinced that life was meaningless after watching entire communities die without reason. The plague did not leave when the fever broke. It lingered in the minds of survivors, an invisible wound that would shape their choices for decades. The legacy of the 1600s plague. The plagues of the 17th century left scars that reshaped Europe. Populations were shattered, entire villages vanished, cities shrank, economies faltered. Labor shortages gave surviving workers more bargaining power, subtly shifting class structures. Nobles found themselves weaker, merchants sometimes stronger. Medicine changed too. The failure of charms and superstition planted seeds for modern science. Slowly, the focus shifted toward observation, cleanliness, and eventually germ theory, though it would take centuries more for true understanding to arrive. Most of all, the memory of plague became cultural. It lived in art, in literature, in sermons and laws. Every future outbreak was measured against it. It taught humanity that life was fragile, society was brittle, and that survival required adaptation. For us today, looking back, it is both terrifying and humbling. Because the truth is, if you time traveled to the 1600s during a plague outbreak, you almost certainly wouldn't survive the week. And that is the brutal reality of the plagues of the 1600s: disease, despair, superstition, and survival. It wasn't just an illness. It was a force that rewrote the world. Entire generations lived under its shadow, and the echoes of their suffering still shape our lives today. If you found this journey into the forgotten horrors of history fascinating, don't let it end here. There are countless more hidden stories waiting in the shadow, stories of bizarre customs, forbidden practices, and strange truths that shape the world in ways we rarely imagine. Make sure to like this video if you enjoyed the deep dive. Subscribe to Weird History Secrets for more long, immersive explorations of the past. And hit the notification bell, so you don't miss the next descent into the strange corners of history. Because as you've just seen, sometimes truth really is stranger, darker, and far more haunting than fiction.